nature and how it is relevant for education. This is the primary purpose, and I believe that it is very important to discuss human nature, because even though education is undoubtedly the second oldest profession, still we do not know how to teach and what to teach. All this happens partly because we overlook what is human nature, or we haven't undertaken rigorous examination into our assumptions about human nature. And right now, with this interdisciplinary study of cognitive science, we have got the opportunity to be much more rigorous in our understanding of what human nature is. And it is that I would like to utilize here. First of all, what exactly is meant by embodiment? This is a trendy word. This is the second presentation with that word in the title. It means many things to many people. Some people argue that cognition is situated, or some people argue that offline cognition is bodily based. There are many such views. All of them can be put under the rubric embodiment. But the common core is that mental phenomena arise out of bodily experience. That means mind and body are not to be understood as discontinuous. At most, they are two ends of a spectrum, which is a radical thesis given the dualistic inclinations that we carry with ourselves. And conceptual metaphor theory, I would say, is the best example, or the most interesting, easy to understand, for me at least, to explain embodiment. Some of us may be familiar, but still, I will give some example. Something like, I gave you an idea. When we say giving an idea is an abstract understanding, I mean, we do not have any concrete experience of giving an idea. So that abstract thing called giving an idea, we understand in terms of the concrete thing of handing over objects. That's why we say, I gave you an idea, or idea went over my head. So this is the basic theory. Abstract concepts are understood metaphorically, which arises in the embodied thesis. So some concepts are directly based on bodily experience, and the rest are metaphorically or metonymically derived out of them. So the whole discontinuity between the conceptual realm and the perceptual realm, we can overcome. We can at least find them as two ends of a spectrum. Let me repeat that. And embodied realism, which is the metaphysical framework arising out of embodied thesis, provides a middle way between many of the age-old debates like realism and idealism, nativism and empiricism, externalism and internalism. Many of these debates, that polarized debates that have been going on for centuries, we can easily find a middle way within the framework of embodied realism. And this in turn helps us to have consilience of knowledge. And why consilience is important, that also I'm going to say. So we all know that battle of the cultures continue. The two cultures that CP Snow talked about, still that culture, that demarcation between, say, humanities on the one hand and sciences on the other, that continues in the academia very stronger. So making knowledge consilient is certainly a formidable challenge in our times. And the most famous exponent of consilience, the recent author Wilson, human condition is the most important frontier of the natural sciences. Conversely, the material world exposed by the natural sciences is the most important frontier of social sciences. So, to put it interestingly, that both frontiers are the same. So if you start from one place, you will reach here, and if you start from the other place, then also you will reach here. That's what that's by saying that frontiers are the same. Of course, Wilson's scheme is more reductionistic, because many of us may become flippantly dismissive of the whole notion of consilience if we understood consilience only in the scheme of Wilson. That's why I refer to William Whewell, who originally coined the term consilience, and his vision is much more alluvial. It's not reductionistic. We have all schemes. The knowledge systems come together. There is nothing incommensurable about it. Some kind of trimming may be required in one system or the other, but that's okay. That is not to swallow one system or the other. So the whole threat of reductionism and everything disappears the moment we understand consilience in terms of William Whewell's vision. So embodiment is the best framework. Embodied thesis provides us the best framework for consilience of knowledge, precisely because of the middle path that it helps us to take between, say, realism and idealism, nativism and empiricism. That middle path helps us to have consilience of knowledge, or at least provides the avenue to have consilience. So when the body is put back in the mind, the compulsion to see the human realm of meanings and that of physical world as binaries with hardly anything common that get reduced. That's what is happening. And it can tackle what Steven Pinker calls the Holy Trinity that holds sway in much of academia, especially in this side, literature, philosophy, and all that side. So the blank slate can no longer be blank if you understand phylogenetic embodiment. Embodiment itself can be understood phylogenetically as well as ontogenetically. Embodiment happened in the history of the species, and it is transmitted. It's not the case that each and every individual in its ontogenetic development undergoes the same thing. That need not be the case, but that is something that is transmitted. And there is no need of a concept of a noble savage, because either we can say that the savage was like us, or we are like the savage. There is no difference as such. And the ghost in the machine, that will also be easily exorcised, precisely because body and mind are no longer seen as discontinuous, because the whole talk about ghost in the machine comes from that attitude only. And the point why I meandered into the notion of consilience is precisely because human nature is something that involves many levels. It can be neuronal level, psychological level, social level. All these levels need to be accommodated if we want to build up the broad contours of a comprehensive account of human nature. So only a consilient approach can help us to develop a comprehensive account of human nature. That's why I want to emphasize that embodied thesis is the framework to have consilience, which in turn will help us to have a comprehensive account of human nature. Now, let me try to find out, it's just an exploration, what embodied thesis implies, tells about human nature. One way to bring out the implications of embodied thesis is by understanding how embodied thesis can explain some aspect of contemplative knowledge. So, we are familiar, especially we in India, most of us are familiar that meditative practices, all of them purportedly bring about change in our ordinary mode of experiencing the world. This can be understood as revisiting the reflexive self-conception. That's very important. The word reflexive is important. It's not something that we deliberate or reflect upon and say, but the kind of self-conception that is implicit, that is implied by the behavior that we show. That is what I call reflexive self-conception. A very lucid characterization of this reflexive self-conception is available in the work of Miri al-Bahari, who says there are 4 modes primarily: thisness, autonomy, consistent self-concern, and ownership. These are the 4 modes of reflexive self-conception. This in turn together give rise to a thick psychological boundary between the self and the world. That's why we have all this talk about the other. The otherness of the other gets aggravated precisely because of this thick psychological boundary. Suppose that is not there, then the otherness of the other will not be so acute. That's one possibility. So, this is evident in the conception of the free-floating self or the separative self, let us call it that way. Separative self is something which has got all these 3 modes. It's not 3 modes, 4 modes. So, which feels to be separated from the web of life and which tries to protect and aggrandize. This is the common experience that most of us have got. We try to protect ourselves, aggrandize ourselves. That is the free-floating or separate self-conception. We need to protect precisely because there is a thick psychological boundary. Had it not been there, perhaps the need to protect, to aggrandize may come down. At least it logically implies like that. And there is an interesting study on intuitive dualism that psychologist Bloom, who argued that children are born dualist. Cartesian, Descartes' baby, that's a famous title. He says that they are predisposed to look at things in terms of physical object and non-physical minds. Of course, he doesn't say that children have that Cartesian dualist metaphysical framework in them or something, but there's a predisposition to treat differently human beings on the one hand and symbol objects. And human being, what is the difference? Human beings have got intentionality. That notion is there through many experiments. Paul Bloom reaches that conclusion. That must be there, that must be innate in children. So the empirical evidence that Bloom provides is mainly about the predisposition to ascribe intentional state and not any metaphysical belief, but that's good enough. So the thick psychological boundary, the hypothesis that I'm making is that the thick psychological boundary between the self and the world is obviously it is dualistic in spirit, because one side of the boundary is mental and the other physical. So this separation is not an all or none affair that we can grant, especially if we accept what is called the prototype view of categories. Then they can understand. And some of us may hold that there is a lot of cross-cultural differences in the way self is conceptualized. Some of us may hold that view. For example, Geography of Thought, Richard Nisbett and others seem to suggest that there is a significant fundamental difference between, say, East Asians conceptualize themselves and Westerners, at least some countries conceptualize themselves. But it need not be the case, especially if we go into the level of reflexive self-conception in terms of free-floating or separative self. I would say that there is no significant difference cross-culturally. Both are consistent with the reflexive self-conception, with that modes that we have enumerated. So, and it is not difficult to see that no culture appears immune from all these things. The way globalization spreads in all East Asian countries also, we can easily infer that no culture is immune from seeking gratification through unlimited consumption and all these things. So, of course, this is Nisbett's own drawing. I'm just trying to show that. For example, Eastern self, the self in group, a part of the self is in group. That means we feel more attached to the immediate group as far as Eastern countries are concerned. Whereas the out group is there, that is common to both. Whereas in the Western self, the self simply touches tangentially. Perhaps it touches only tangentially to that in group. So that difference in degree we have to grant between, say, the Western conceptualization of self and the Eastern conception. But that in turn does not or need not affect or need not point that there is any fundamental difference in the reflexive self-conception in terms of free-floating self or separative self with the four modes. That's the point I'm making. Because in one case it is slightly in the other case it is simply touches. That's the only difference. Difference is slightly in degree only. So whatever claim that we make can be universal. It need not be culture specific. So, okay, now it is some kind of a... Now let us go back to the point that we mentioned about Descartes' babies and all these things. So there is some kind of, I would say that there is some kind of an Orwell's problem in cognitive science. Orwell's problem, Plato's problem, we know. Orwell's problem is that there is so much of evidence for something, but still we do not realize it. There is so much of evidence for embodiment to be the case, but we find it difficult to accept it. That's what the Orwell's problem. This happens because we are all Descartes' babies who are reflexively inclined towards being oblivious to being, overlooking, towards overlooking embodiment. And that may be the reason why even though there is so much of evidence for embodiment to be the case, we are not able to appreciate, we are not able to see that. So, Descartes' baby, that's why Descartes' babies cannot appreciate embodiment, and the Holy Trinity continue to have their way in our everyday conceptualization. Partially because of we are Descartes' baby. So much of the systematic investigations into the mind which presuppose either plain dualism or covert dualism, famous criticism of Searle, saying that all these artificial intelligence research and all these things, they presuppose they have some covert dualism in that, or even neuroscientific reductionism. All this involve, all this stems from that pre-theoretic or reflexive commitment to dualism. That can well be the case. And if you want one more example or one more way to elucidate the nature of pre-reflective self-conception is just look at our relationship with nature. How do we understand? Innate bias towards dualism that is manifested in our relationship with nature also. Either we talk about worshipping nature or controlling nature. Even the whole tribal understanding of nature and all these things which we become sometimes romantic, that's also a matter of worshipping things. So whether we try to worship or control nature, that simply resembles the flight or fight. What I want to say is that whether we worship or control nature, there is an alienation. That is still within the framework of the separative or free-floating self. It's not a matter of feeling ourselves to be part of the web of life. Had it been the case, then there is no scope for either worship or control. So both modes precludes the possibility of feeling the self to be a part of nature, and that's the point that I'll just make it. And this in turn can be understood in terms of the way we work with categories. As far as our cognition is concerned, we know that to cognize is to categorize. That is, categorization plays a very significant role. But, so the self on the one hand and the world, there are two categories, looking from the inside to the outside. That's our experience, isn't it? We look from the inside to the outside world. They form two fundamental categories around which much of our lives revolve around. So there are two pitfalls, I would say, associated with this categorical thinking. First one is that underestimate the difference within the members of a category and overestimate their similarity. If something is within a category, we tend to overestimate their similarity and overestimate the difference outside different members of different categories that we tend to overestimate, and we miss the whole picture. So as far as the first pitfall is concerned, much of the pitfall can be contained if we adopt what is called the prototype attitude towards categories rather than the classical view. That can reduce the first pitfall. And with regard to the second one is concerned, that requires some kind of change in the reflexive self-conception. Without that, we may not be able to overcome the second pitfall. So this experience of looking outside from the inside, and we can say that, so there is no scope for in its whole, the notion, the feeling, the reflexive realization of being part of the whole, which encompasses both outside and inside. That is something that there is no scope for realizing that, as long as our experience is that of looking at the outside from the inside. So much of the mystical experience, if we study, that amounts to reflexively recognizing the whole. That's the whole point. The whole mystical experience, I'm not saying the whole, but at least some part of it can be understood in terms of reflexive ability, at least momentary. It is not a permanent change or something. It is a momentary. It can be even the drugs and the changes that happen due to drugs may also be more or less the same. That I'm not denying that. But which in turn has got much more side effects which may not be there due to this. If it's the result of meditation practice or something, that may be the only difference between doing meditation and taking some drugs. So where does this self-conception come from? If you want to go beyond it or if you want to change it, it is important to understand its moorings. One way to locate the roots of it is in terms of wandering mind. I think it is easy for us to understand what is a wandering mind, because much of the time, nowadays even neuroscientists talk about wandering mind. They have some other terms like spontaneous thought or something like that. So what they say is that much of our time, perhaps 40% or 50% of our waking time is involved in wandering mind. Mind simply wanders. We do not have any control. We cannot terminate it. What we call the daydreaming is a paradigmatic example of wandering mind. So wandering mind, along with the disposition to attribute intentionality, which we talked in the context of Paul Bloom's study, that amount to intuitive implicit dualism. This is one contention or hypothesis that I make. What is wandering mind? You can easily understand. It's a movement away from the present to the past and the future. You can easily see that. The chattering of the thought that always goes from past to the future, which occasionally glimpses into the present. And it is a change in the unit of identification. That each time whenever a thought comes, we have this identification, I am this, I am this. That is what Metzinger calls the change in the unit of identification. And it's a case of loss of mental autonomy. Mental autonomy in the sense, it's not something that we originate, we intentionally start, let me start daydreaming now. That's not something that we find ourselves to be in daydreaming or wandering. That's all. So there is no autonomy in that. So the feature of mind wandering is that it is something, it's a decoupling from perceptual motor system. As far as now we don't have any directly coupled with, as far as our consciousness is concerned, as far as our attention is concerned, it's not coupled with perceptual and motor system. That's what primarily mind wandering amounts to. And what Metzinger calls the transparency of the mental. By transparency he means we use system or we use representation without realizing that it is only a representation or a model. We end up identifying ourselves with the content of the model. That's what by transparency Thomas Metzinger means. So these two things can be said to be resulting in identification with the representation. Yeah. So all these practices like mindfulness practice and other meditative practice helps us to reduce identification. It is by a matter of observing thoughts as they are without getting identified. So the whole transparency that can get reduced. And as and more we are capable of looking at thoughts as they are and our focus is on the present, this thing called decoupling that also naturally comes down. So the possibility is that if decoupling and transparency, everything result in the kind of free-floating or separative self-conception, then mindfulness or opaqueness, that in turn can give rise to another kind of self-conception. That in turn is possible. And the primary characteristic of that self-conception will be the reflexive ability to see ourselves as part of the whole, which in turn can reduce the second pitfall associated with categorization that we talked about. That's what is written here. The thick boundary between self and the world can come down. So there's a famous statement made by the psychologist Daniel Wegner. Human self-portrait is at most a caricature. That is what is happening. The conceptualization that we have got ourselves in terms of being autonomous, having free will, and through numerous studies, Wegener eloquently shows that there is hardly anything like free will in the way we understand ourselves to be having free will. So that's why he says that human self-portrait is only a caricature. So there is always the possibility of redrawing the portrait, and that's why the role of education comes in. So the task of drawing the self-portrait more accurately as it amounts to living with the fact of embodiment. So free-floating self-conception does not do justice to embodiment or to the role of what I call the cognitive unconscious. Much of our thought is unconscious. That is something that we can easily understand given the abundant evidence that we have in our personal empirical study. So human nature includes a failure to realize certain important aspects of human nature. That is the point. We are constitutionally, we simply, of course, the word constitution may give rise to the notion that it is something hardwired and we cannot break it, but that's not the sense in which I'm using the word constitution. But in extremely, we find ourselves to be incapable of realizing certain aspects of human nature, which terms to be the distinguishing aspect of human nature. And therefore, the role of education in making humans understand themselves more accurately, that's very significant. Now, the point is that this is indeed the need of the hour, not just because we need to portray it as accurately as possible, but also because it can have huge implications in the way we conduct ourselves. For example, the doomsday scenario that Professor Mukherjee portrayed in the morning, that may have a lot to do with the reflexive or separative self-conception. Our inability to realize that we are part of nature, reflexively realize that in turn may underlie our eagerness to conquer nature without even realizing that we can never conquer something of which we are part. That's a fundamental folly that we have been committing, continue to commit. All of this can be traced to the self-conception that we have got. So that forms part of the overall task of making human life less conflict-ridden and more harmonious. In fact, many others have pointed out, for example, if you look into the works of Krishnamurti and others, it's very easy to see the correlation, how the self-conception gives rise to all these things like antagonism, violence, conflict, and all these have their moorings in one way or the other in the way we understand ourselves. Krishnamurti has eloquently shown, and not just Krishnamurti, even social psychologists like Mark Leary, who has written about the curse of the self and all these things, where he very eloquently shows how some of the traits that have had their role in, say, the hunter-gatherer ancestral environment have become counterproductive in the present-day environment. All of these traits may have had their role, but the present-day environment has changed a lot, and it gives rise to so much of destruction. The Mark and others. So the point that I'm making is that embodied cognition, given the implications, given the way it talks and shows about human nature, that provides the right framework for what we may call transformative education. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have two very challenging papers about embodiment, very different, and we're running ahead of schedule, so we have plenty of time for questions.
Did I finish quite quickly?
Yeah, I thank the speaker a lot for the presentation, and I think it was bang on the subject of the conference today on human nature and education, and trying to populate that sphere with a lot of very important conceptual inputs. I think the particular role of education in helping us see ourselves has been brought up in a very, very significant manner, and his reference to the Krishnamurti schools and to other scholars is also very important. I thank you again. I enjoyed this very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. So if I've understood rightly, then the thing was that embodied cognition in a way enable us to see ourselves as a part of the whole. And where you talked about breaking the boundaries between the world and the self, but my question is that like, you know, from Wittgenstein till Davidson and so on, they also talk about language, self, world, and language. So somehow I felt that that point of language, in the triangulation where in the process of understanding ourselves and ourselves as the whole, so that medium of language is missing in your talk. So
Yeah, thank you. Of course, language, if we accept, shall I?
It's on.
Yeah. If we accept the tenets of cognitive semantics, then language reflects the conceptual structure that we have got. For example, according to them, language is only the secondary representational system. So if there is a change in the conceptual structure, for example, in the way we conceptualize ourselves, suppose there is a change, that in turn will be reflected in language also. That's the way I put it. Of course, language is important. I overlooked or I did not mention about that. But since language is treated as only a secondary representational system, what is primary is to talk about the conceptual structure that we have got. That may be the reason why I did not pay much attention to language.
Just a small query. You mentioned at one point of your presentation that we as human beings are constitutionally incapable of realizing the human nature. If we are constitutionally incapable, then what is the point that you're trying to make? Are you trying to make the point that for this transformative education we need to have, say, this sort of mindfulness meditation and all these things as part of our curriculum or something like that? What is your suggestion here?
No, of course, the word constitution I also try to explain that it's not something that is hardwired. That is not the sense in which I'm using. Perhaps I should not have even used the word constitution. I immediately realized and try to explain it. It's not, I do not mean it as something hardwired, unchangeable, immutable or something. It is something that is subject to change. Now, for example, since you raised the issue, let me tell one more thing. For example, if Julian Jaynes is correct, then only for the last 3,000 years only we have been having a self. If Julian Jaynes is correct, I'm not saying it is correct or not. I also want to investigate whether it is correct, but so far I have not been able. So, if he is correct, then there is still the possibility of a change in that self-conception, that possibility open, for which mindfulness and all these things can play a significant role. And you go into Jaynes again. Jaynes say that in the breakdown of the bicameral mind, the self-conception originated, and those times there were a lot of environmental changes which necessitated the breakdown of the bicameral mind. And such environmental changes seem to be happening now also. So there is still a possibility that a breakdown is there. Coming to the second part of your question, yeah, I would say that it need not be mindfulness or something. For example, in Krishnamurti schools, so much of importance is given to this thing called pure observation. Just look at observe, just look at leaves, just look at skies, whatever is there, just look at it. The pure observation. All these things, this is basically a matter of coupling between sensory perceptual thing. I hope I'm making myself clear. So all these practices like pure observation, all these things should be made part of education. That is what I want to say. Yeah.
I'm going to jump in here. I'm not a psychologist, but I think Julian Jaynes's hypothesis was exploded a long time ago. It depends on a particular reading of Greek texts, which I think has been thoroughly debunked. So, I mean, the question I've got that's relevant here is you, on one of your slides, towards the end, you said that depicting the self-portrait accurately was an important educational goal that could help reduce conflict. I'm curious about the wording in that. So a lot of psychologists don't talk about the self at all. The dominant paradigm in Western mainstream psychology has been in the field of personality studies, the Big Five theory of personality. It doesn't really support a useful conception of the self. So psychologists generally talk about self-concept, right? And so The self-concept is something they think they can talk about scientifically as something that they can read off from how people talk. But they don't tend to hypothesize a real self. So when you talk about mindfulness as a relevant tool here, a discipline, I thought you were going to say that by practicing mindfulness, people could be, they could more accurately grasp truths about themselves, not something about their self-portrait. Right? Because you were talking about depicting the self-portrait accurately was the way you put it. So I'm a little confused about how you're thinking about the relationship between a self-representation and a self, and what you really want to be saying here about the educational enterprise and how it's supposed to help.
Coming to the point that psychologists in general do not talk about self, that is well the case. Many of the psychologists, mainstream psychologists, may want to shy away because we cannot have rigorous experimental data on that or something like that. But still there are many psychologists who use it. For example, Daniel Wegner himself, who uses the word self-portrait. There are many psychologists who use it. And were psychologists shy, still shy, their philosophers can continue to talk. That freedom is there. So I think that's what I can say. Coming to the second point, how the portrayal is possible, isn't it? Yeah, the point that I wanted to make is that given our, present way, our tendency, or given the predominance of mind-wandering stage and some other inclinations like predisposition to, ascribe intentionality. No, I'm not saying that predisposition can be changed or need to be changed. Not at all the case. But at least take this thing called mind-wandering, which seems to be the default state. If you are simply sitting, it will wander. Now the point, and this decoupling is a necessary feature of it. We get decoupled with that. Given this, that gives rise to a particular kind of self-conception. That is the point that I'm making. Free-floating, separative self, which considers itself to be alienated from the nature. And this in turn is the ground for so much of insecurity. And in order to ward off that feeling of insecurity, the nagging feeling of insecurity, insufficiency, we try to do so many things. We try to acquire, aggrandize. This is part of the by and large human life, can be explained in terms of this. Now the point that by quoting Daniel Wegner, what I wanted to say is that human self-portrait is a caricature that basically means, caricature we all know, that's some kind of exaggeration. So we have an exaggerated notion of our own capacity, belief in our own capacity, just like this thing called free will. We believe that there is something called free will. But a lot of experiments, whether done by neuroscientists or psychologists, clearly state that the kind of free will we think we have got is never the case. That's what backward referral and all these things clear. I would say clearly established, but of course, that must be the case. That's all I can say. It clearly establishes, having read Daniel Wegner and others. I am convinced, that's all I can say. So, the self-portrait that we have got contains exaggerated notions of capacity, because free will is matter of free will, the belief in free will and free-floating self, they are also quite related. Because if free will has got some kind of a contra-causal notion in that, that means you think that I am free, not because I am freely deciding things, not because of any things in nature that makes me do something or choose something. That is the assumption behind free will, isn't it? So there is an element of contra-causality involved in that. And this kind of belief in contra-causality can be appreciated only by a free-floating self, which considers itself to be separate or free-floating from the nature. So that's the relationship between free-floating, belief in free-floating self and belief in all these kinds like free will. So redrawing the portrait amounts to understanding that we are part and parcel, reflexively realizing that we are part and parcel of all that is there. So there is hardly any scope for free will. So the reduction in the belief in free will and overcoming the pull or overcoming the pull of the free-floating self, that will go in tandem, that will go together. That's what I mean by redrawing the portrait.
Thank you for both the speaker. Actually, I think philosophy conference is working for me, because from morning to evening the question changed a lot. So in the morning, in the speech called Education for the Spaces, I asked the question, there is always a conflict between the spaces and between the human for survival. Now you have raised a very important question that how can we conquer something which we are part of? Like if we are whole, then you cannot conquer because it's you. So I am finding there is a philosophical dichotomy or challenge, like these two are different ideology, or some after realization you find that you are part of both, or you are something else. Like I'm literally confused now, we are fighting for our survival or we are part of whole, then what we are doing here means no fight at all. So this is my confusion. Actually it's working, but I still not finding like how the education shift should be taken place so that this fighting can become love, or we can say sometimes love can become fighting.
Are you coming to my talk tomorrow morning?
You have answered? I hope he has answered.
Another question.
Yeah, please.
I think what you're saying is there's a progression of cognitive evolution. So sometimes they say representative cognition happened many thousands of years ago. Later on, after thousands of years, people conceptualized cognitively through narrative. Later on, maybe 2,000-3,000 years ago, the evolution was towards cognitive analysis. And I think what you're saying is that today we need another rung on our evolution, cognitive, and that if we focus on this as the education which we need, perhaps we can meet major challenges. Have I got you?
Yeah, somewhat. Yeah.
I have just one question, but it has three parts.
Yes.
First, when you go from the caricature of self-image to the correct self-image, I suspect it will be too dangerous to be confronted. Right? The way you normally consider yourself and you really start understanding fully yourself, it's more dangerous for you, for the person who conceives that. A. B. Will it not be too multidimensional? I mean, giving analogy from our mythology, when the Krishna shows his huge shape, Virat Swarup, yeah, it's difficult to comprehend. So the second point I'm making is, it is too multidimensional. Self is not such a thing that you can comprehend in the manner probably it is being suggested. It's too dynamic, too complex, too multidimensional, too multi-layered to be comprehended. And the third point that I want to make is, whatever you are able to understand, does it not change yourself? And therefore what you have understood is no longer the correct one. It's too dynamic. The self is too dynamic to be understood at any point of time. The point you understand, it has eluded you, it has gone to something else.
No, I certainly accept the dangerous aspect that you mentioned. It's certainly dangerous in the sense it has got so much of implications. That's why whole talk about, rewriting philosophy in the flesh and all these things. It has got so much of implications that I grant. That certainly, it can be dangerous also. It can affect the dangerous, basically it means affecting the status quo. That is certainly the case. We are talking about affecting or changing the status quo only. And coming to the second point that you made, yes, I accept that it is multidimensional, it has got several levels, and perhaps I am concentrating only on one aspect of it that I myself was not aware. I'm concentrating or I'm focusing only on one aspect or one feature of the self, that of free-floating, separative, or being part of it. That may be only one aspect of it, that I grant it. Now whether that is the fulcrum, that is the center, I don't want to make any tall claim on the spur of the moment, but that may well be the case, but right now. But I admit that it's only one aspect.